"If you can open this safe, I'll marry you." Audra Langdon didn't look up from the tablet in her hand when she said it. The words were flint, sharp and dismissive, aimed at no one and everyone. Her heels clicked a nervous rhythm on the polished concrete floor of her penthouse office, a stark counterpoint to the city's silent panorama glittering 50 stories below. The safe, a hulking black monster of riveted steel and brass, sat against the far wall like a tombstone. It was the only thing in the room older than her father's ambition, a stubborn relic in her world of glass and light-speed data. The janitor, a man with shoulders broad enough to carry secrets, paused his work. He was wiping down the base of the safe with a focused calm that seemed almost defiant in the tense air. He didn't look at her, but she felt his stillness cut through her frustration. She finally glanced up, her patience worn thin by a day of failed engineers and condescending smirks from her board. "Did you hear me?" The man looked at her then. His eyes were a deep, steady brown, clear and unreadable. He rose slowly from his crouch, the cleaning cloth held loosely in one hand. "I heard you, Ms. Langdon," he said, his voice even, without a trace of the subservience she was used to. "But a lock like that doesn't open because someone dares it to. It opens because someone understands it." Audra arched an eyebrow, a flicker of surprise. "So you're an expert on antique safes now?" He didn't answer, just returned to his task, folding the cloth in his palm with a quiet, deliberate precision. Audra watched him for a beat too long, then let out a short, humorless laugh. "Right. Didn't think so." She turned on her heel, the moment over. She didn't know why she'd said it. Maybe it was the pressure from Leland, the smug chairman who had all but told her she wasn't fit to run her own company. Maybe it was the sheer insolence of the safe itself, a final problem her father had left behind that she couldn't solve with money or power. Or maybe it was the way the janitor had looked at it, not as a piece of furniture to be dusted, but as a puzzle to be respected. Whatever it was done. She strode to her desk, swiped a file into her briefcase, and headed for the private elevator, disappearing into the throat of the empire she commanded but couldn't quite control. By the time Penn Calder finished his shift, the building had settled into the deep, humming sleep of a machine at rest. He stood for a long moment in the empty office, the scent of citrus cleaner and Audra Langdon's expensive perfume still hanging in the air. He looked around once, at the sprawling desk, the glowing screens, the city laid out like a carpet of jewels. Then his eyes returned to the safe. He walked over to it, not as a janitor, but as something else entirely. He knelt, his posture changing, his focus sharpening. He didn't touch the dial. He didn't try the handle. He simply placed the palm of his hand flat against the cold steel of the door, closed his eyes, and listened. To what, he wasn't sure. The settling of the building, the ghost of a memory, the faint, internal sigh of tumblers that hadn't turned in a decade. A lock like that, his wife used to say, has a heartbeat. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it. He stayed there for a minute, maybe two, lost in a silence shaped like a life he no longer lived. Then he stood, gathered his cart, and left, the massive, safe-standing guard over its secrets. The next morning, Audra's assistant, a perpetually frazzled young man named Ian, placed a steaming coffee on her desk and launched into a litany of the day's disasters. Leland has moved the quarterly review up to Friday. The schematics from Berlin are corrupted, and someone from Forbes is asking for a comment on the rumor that our Q3 projections are creative. But Audra wasn't listening. Her gaze was fixed on the floor beside the safe. There, almost hidden in the shadow, was a small, folded piece of paper. It looked like a discarded napkin. She waved Ian into silence, crossed the room, and picked it up. "Ms. Langdon?" She unfolded it. It wasn't a note. There were no words. It was a drawing, executed with the stunning precision of a master draftsman. It showed a single, incredibly complex component of a lock mechanism, a sidebar with a unique, serrated edge, and next to it, a tiny, almost invisible arrow pointed to a single point on one of the serrations, with a number beside it, 0.02 millimeters. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a diagnosis, the subtlest of misalignments. The kind of flaw her high-paid engineers, with all their laser scanners and digital modeling, had missed completely. The kind of flaw you could only find by touch, by feel, by listening for a heartbeat. Audra stared at the drawing, her own heart suddenly beating a little faster. She looked from the perfect lines on the cheap paper to the immovable steel door of the safe, then out into the empty hallway. The janitor. The man with the quiet hands and the steady eyes. "Ian," she said, her voice low and sharp. "Get me the personnel file for the overnight janitor, the third shift, now!" Ian blinked, his face a mask of polite confusion. "The janitor's file? Ms. Langdon, is there a problem with the cleaning service?" "Just get it, Ian," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. She didn't take her eyes off the hand-drawn schematic in her fingers. It was drawn on a cheap, disposable napkin, but the lines were more confident and precise than anything her six-figure engineering team had produced in a week. He scurried away. Audra walked back to her desk, the napkin held as if it were evidence. She spread it flat, the intricate drawing a stark, analog island on the sleek black surface of her desk. It was a challenge, a whisper in a world where she was used to shouts. Minutes later, Ian returned, holding a single flimsy manila folder as if it were contaminated. He placed it gingerly on her desk. "Penn Calder, started 6 months ago, clean record." Audra snatched the file. It was insultingly thin. Inside, a one-page application form, a copy of a driver's license, and a W-4. The photo showed the man from last night. Strong jaw, calm eyes that seemed to hold more space than they should. Under work history, there were only 2 entries: a warehouse job in the industrial district and a maintenance position at a downtown hotel. It was the resume of a ghost, a man deliberately leaving no tracks, no education, no special skills listed, nothing. She slammed the folder shut. It made no sense. A man with this level of mechanical intuition, this drafting skill, was scrubbing floors? It wasn't just improbable. It was impossible. People didn't hide genius like this unless they were running from something. A new kind of energy sparked through her. Not frustration, but a hunter's curiosity. She couldn't just call him in and interrogate him. A man this careful would simply deny everything, retreating deeper into his shell. No, she had to continue the conversation he had started. She had to bait the trap. That evening, before she left, Audra walked over to a low credenza that housed her father's old collection of engineering texts. She pulled out a thick, leather-bound volume, Fletcher's Treatise on Lever and Tumbler Mechanisms. It was an obscure, almost legendary text among lock designers. She opened it to a chapter detailing the Cerberus, a notoriously complex triple-redundant lock her father had been obsessed with but had never managed to replicate. She left the book open on the small table beside the safe, a bottle of cleaning spray and a cloth placed neatly beside it, as if a janitor had been interrupted mid-task. It was a question disguised as an oversight. The door to Penn Calder's apartment opened into a life that was meticulously managed. It was a small, clean space that smelled faintly of laundry soap and the cinnamon toast his daughter, Willa, loved. Framed pictures she had drawn, of smiling suns and lopsided cats, were the only decorations on the walls. "Did you bring me a moon rock, Daddy?" Willa asked from her perch on the sofa. She was a small, bright-eyed girl of 7, with her father's steady gaze and a spirit that far outsized her frame. A clear tube ran from a humming machine on the floor to the nebulizer mask she held loosely in her lap. Penn smiled, the weariness of the city falling away from him. "Not tonight, Doodlebug. The moon was closed for inventory." She giggled. "Silly. How was work?" "Quiet," he said, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. He had been on edge all day, regretting the impulse that had made him draw that schematic. It was an old addiction, the need to solve a puzzle, to correct an error. His hands remembered the language of machines, even when his mind wanted to forget. For 5 years, he had been just a father, a janitor, an invisible man. It was safer that way, safer for Willa. The life before, the hum of the lab, the smell of machine oil and hot metal, his wife Alara laughing as they solved a problem on a whiteboard. That life was a locked room he never intended to enter again. That night, back at Langdon Industries, the silence of the 50th floor felt different. It felt like it was watching him. He pushed his cart into Audra's office and saw it immediately. The book. He stopped, his hand tightening on the handle of the cart. Fletcher's treatise. He hadn't seen a copy in years. He walked over, his heart thumping a slow, heavy beat against his ribs. It was open to the chapter on the Cerberus lock. A test. A direct, silent question from her to him. He could ignore it, walk away, mop the floor and empty the trash and pretend he was the man his file said he was. But his fingers itched. He ran a hand over his face, a war raging within him. This was the world that had given him everything and then taken it all away in a storm of smoke and fire. He looked at the open page, at the intricate, beautiful, impossible design. Alara had called it the ghost lock. She'd spent months on a prototype before. He couldn't help himself. He reached into his cart and pulled out a small metal tin. Inside, nestled in soft foam, were a few simple, handmade tools. He picked up a long, thin tension wrench he'd fashioned himself from the underwire of a binder. He didn't touch the book. Instead, he turned to the small trash can beside Audra's desk. He retrieved a single, sturdy paperclip. For the next 10 minutes, his hands were a blur of quiet, focused motion. With a pair of small pliers from his tin, he bent the paperclip, twisting it, filing a minuscule notch here, flattening a tip there. It wasn't rushed. It was the work of a master craftsman, every movement economical and perfect. When he was done, it was no longer a paperclip. It was a bypass pick, custom-shaped for a specific flaw in the Cerberus design, a flaw that Fletcher's own book didn't even mention, a flaw only 2 people in the world had ever known about. He placed the newly formed tool gently on the open page of the book, a gleaming metal question mark against the old ink. His answer. He took a deep breath, the smell of old paper and new risk filling his lungs. He had just knocked on the door of his own past. Now he had to wait to see if she would open it. Audra found it the next morning, resting on the open book like a silver insect. It wasn't just a bent paperclip. It was an instrument. The angles were too perfect, the tip filed to a needle-sharp point, a small, grooved indentation made for a fingertip's grip. It was a thing of purpose, made by a hand that knew exactly what it was doing. She picked it up, her mind racing. The schematic had been a diagnosis. This was the surgeon's scalpel. She called in her head of engineering, a man named Garrett, whose face was permanently fixed in a state of weary apology. She held up the object between her thumb and forefinger. "What is this?" Garrett squinted. "A paperclip, Miss Langdon?" "Don't patronize me, Garrett. What is its function?" He took it from her, turning it over in his palm. He frowned, his brow furrowed in concentration. "The tension on these bends is remarkable. It looks like a custom pick of some kind. But for what lock? This design isn't standard. It's too specific." He looked up, his eyes wide with a dawning, incredulous respect. "Whoever made this has an intimate knowledge of the target mechanism, and they did it with a paperclip. Ms. Langdon, this is the work of a ghost." Audra took the pick back. "Get out, Garrett." He left, looking more confused than ever. A ghost. That's what Penn Calder was. A ghost haunting the halls of his own past. But why? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sharp, unwelcome voice of Leland Croft, the chairman of the board, striding into her office unannounced. He was a man who dressed in expensive suits that couldn't hide the cheapness of his character. He smiled, a predatory flash of white. "Audra, still communing with your father's paperweight?" he asked, gesturing toward the safe. "The board is growing concerned. Your sentimentality is becoming a liability. We have a hostile acquisition bid from Omnicorp on the table, and you're wasting time trying to crack a box of memories." "Those memories, Leland, include the original patent files for the Helios guidance system," Audra shot back, her voice like ice. "The same system Omnicorp is trying to replicate. The files in that safe could give us the leverage to file an injunction that would bankrupt them. If you could get to them," Leland purred. "Which you can't. The vote is on Friday. Unless you present a viable strategy to neutralize Omnicorp by then, the board will be forced to accept their offer. And you'll be the CEO who lost her father's company." He paused at the door. "Stop playing games, Audra. Your time is running out." The threat hung in the air long after he was gone. Her time was running out. Her curiosity had just become a weapon, and her ghost was the only one who knew how to wield it. That afternoon, Penn sat with Willa in the sterile waiting room of a clinic, the air smelling of rubbing alcohol and anxiety. Willa was coloring, her tongue stuck out in concentration as she tried to stay within the lines of a cartoon horse. "Daddy," she said without looking up, "is the medicine going to get more expensive?" Penn's heart gave a painful thud. "Why do you ask, sweet pea? I heard you on the phone. You sounded worried." She finally looked at him, her gaze unnervingly direct. "We can sell my bike. I don't ride it that much anyway." He reached out and brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead. "You will never sell your bike. Don't you worry about money, okay? That's my job. Your job is to be 7. "Okay," she said, but her eyes were still troubled. She went back to her coloring, and Penn felt the walls of his quiet, manageable life begin to press in. The janitor's salary was enough for rent, for groceries, for the co-pays on her current medication. But there was nothing left over, no safety net, no room for the ground to shift beneath them. That night, he entered Audra's office with a sense of foreboding. He knew the game had to end. He couldn't afford the risk. She was there, sitting at her desk, waiting for him. The room was dark except for the single lamp on her desk, casting her in a pool of golden light. She looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable. In her hand, she held the paperclip pick. "Good evening, Mr. Calder," she said, her voice calm, measured. "I believe this is yours." Penn's stomach tightened. He said nothing, just gripped the handle of his cart. "It's a beautiful piece of work," she continued, standing and walking toward him. "A bypass pick, specifically for a Cerberus-class lock. A design so rare, only a handful of people have ever seen the schematics." She stopped a few feet from him, her eyes boring into his. "According to my company's archives, only 3 people have ever had clearance for that project. My father, a lead engineer named Alistair Finch, and his brilliant protege, a young woman named Ilara." Penn flinched. The name hit him like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. It was the first time he'd heard someone say his wife's name in this building in 5 years. Audra saw the crack in his armor, the sudden sharp pain in his eyes. She pressed her advantage, her voice softening slightly. "I was a teenager when she worked here, but I remember my father talking about her. He said she didn't just build machines, she understood their souls. He said her husband was just as gifted." Penn remained silent, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. "The schematic? The pick," Audra said, her voice now a whisper. "You're not a janitor. I don't know what you're running from, and right now, I don't care." She stepped closer, holding out the pick. "I have a board meeting on Friday. I have a man trying to steal this company. Everything my father built, everything I have worked for, is on the line. And I believe the key to saving it is inside that safe." She looked from his eyes to the hulking metal beast against the wall. "I need it open, and you are going to open it for me." The silence in the room stretched, thick and heavy. Penn's face was a mask of stone, but Audra could see the storm in his eyes. He finally shook his head. A single, sharp movement of refusal. No. The word was quiet, but absolute. "You don't understand what you're asking," he said, his voice low and strained. "That world, I left it behind for a reason. I'm a janitor. That's all." "I don't believe you," Audra countered, stepping closer. "And neither do you. I saw your drawing. I saw the tool you made. That's not a man who has left anything behind. That's a man who is pretending." "You have no right," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You sit in this tower, and you have no idea what your company has cost people." The words hit her, a surprising blow. "What are you talking about?" He looked away, his jaw tight. "I won't do it. My life is quiet now. I have responsibilities." He was thinking of Willa, her laugh, the steady rhythm of her breathing machine in the night, the fragile peace he had built for them out of the wreckage of his life. Audra saw the fierce protective light in his eyes and understood. He wasn't motivated by money or fear. He was motivated by love. Her strategy shifted. "Leland Croft isn't just trying to take my company," she said softly. "He's trying to erase my father's legacy. Everything he built, the good and the bad. Leland wants to gut it for parts and sell it to the highest bidder. This isn't just business, it's personal." She paused, letting the words sink in. "That safe is a masterpiece. Ilara knew it. My father knew it. And you know it. Are you really going to let it stay silent forever, just so a man like Leland can win?" He didn't answer, but she saw the conflict warring in his face. She played her final card. "You said you have responsibilities," she said. "I saw the medical alert bracelet on your daughter's wrist when she was here last month for the company family day." Penn went rigid. "Leave her out of this." "I can't," Audra said, her voice firm but not unkind. "Because she's the reason you're here, isn't she? This quiet life, this steady paycheck. It's for her." She took a deep breath. "Help me, Penn. Help me, and I will make you a promise. Langdon Industries has the best corporate health insurance in the country. The executive plan covers everything: experimental treatments, specialist consultations, out-of-state travel. No questions asked. I will put you and your daughter on that plan, for life. Whatever she needs, whenever she needs it, the company will provide. That's my offer." He stared at her, his composure finally cracking. It was an impossible offer. A lifeline he never dreamed he'd see. He thought of Willa's question in the clinic, her willingness to sell her own bicycle. He thought of the gnawing fear that her condition could turn on a dime, leaving him helpless. "On my terms," he said finally, the words tasting like surrender and hope. "Anything," Audra breathed, a wave of relief washing over her. "I work only at night, after the building is empty. No one sees me, no one knows. Not your assistant, not your security chief. Just you and me." "Done. And I need tools," he said. "Things your engineers have probably never even heard of. A borescope with a variable focus lens, a magnetic pin tumbler set, and a diamond core drill bit. 3/16 of an inch. It has to be precise." Audra nodded, already typing the list into her phone. "I'll have them here by tomorrow night." The next night, the office was transformed. The lights were dimmed. A heavy canvas drop cloth was spread on the floor. On it, laid out on a soft cloth like a surgeon's instruments, were the tools Audra had procured. Penn knelt before the safe, and the transformation was immediate. The weary janitor disappeared, replaced by a man of intense, almost unnerving focus. He slipped a stethoscope into his ears. The bell pressed against the cold steel door. He closed his eyes. "What are you listening for?" Audra whispered, kneeling nearby. "The gaps," he said, not opening his eyes. "The space between the tumblers. Every lock has a voice. You just have to learn its language." For an hour, the only sounds were the soft, rhythmic click of the dial as Penn turned it, a fraction of a millimeter at a time, and the whisper of his own breathing. Audra found herself holding her breath, mesmerized. She was watching a master at work. He wasn't fighting the machine. He was conversing with it. He reached for a tension wrench, applying the slightest pressure to the lock. "The first tumbler is set," he murmured. "Your father used a false gate system on the first two. A scarecrow. Most people would spend a week trying to get past them." As he worked, his brow furrowed in concentration. The scent of the lubricating oil seemed to trigger something. For a fleeting second, the memory ambushed him. Ilara, her face smudged with grease, laughing in their old workshop. "The third tumbler is always the liar, Pen," she had said, her eyes sparkling. "It tells you it's set when it's just settling in to trick you." He blinked, the memory receding, leaving an ache in its place. "What is it?" Audra asked, noticing the shift in his expression. "Nothing," he said quickly. "Just a ghost." He worked for another hour before finally leaning back, pulling the stethoscope from his ears. He looked drained, but his eyes held a new light. "The first two combinations are bypassed," he said, "but the third is a gravity lock with a time delay. I can't force it. I have to wait for it to release on its own schedule." He began packing the tools with the same care he'd used to unwrap them. "We're done for tonight." Audra nodded, a strange mix of disappointment and awe swirling within her. As he stood to leave, she noticed he had left one of his own handmade tools on the canvas, a small, uniquely shaped hook pick. It was worn smooth from use. It was the only object in the room that felt personal, that felt like it had a history. "You said the third tumbler was the liar," she said, thinking back to his strange comment. Pen stopped at the door, his back to her. "It's what she always used to say." She. He left without another word. Audra stood alone in the quiet office, staring at the safe. It wasn't just a box of corporate secrets anymore. It was a memory box. And she was beginning to suspect that Pen Calder wasn't just opening it for her. He was opening it for a ghost. She. The word echoed in the silent office long after Pen had gone. It hung in the air, reframing everything. This wasn't just a job for him. It was a pilgrimage. Audra couldn't shake it. Sleep was impossible. She sat at her desk, the city lights blurring into a meaningless smear below. Who was she? The name Ilara echoed in her memory, a fragment from a past she had barely paid attention to. Using her personal laptop and encrypted access codes, she bypassed the standard corporate network and dove into the deep archives, the digital catacombs where the company's history was buried. She typed in the name, Ilara Calder. The search returned a handful of results. Commendations, project files, patents pending. A digital ghost of a brilliant career. Then she cross-referenced the name with news archives from 5 years ago. A single article appeared, from a local business journal. The headline was small, deliberately understated. Minor fire contained at Langdon Industries R&D lab. Audra's blood ran cold. She read the article, her breath catching in her throat. The fire had been attributed to a faulty transformer. Minimal property damage. One fatality. An employee who had been working late on a priority project. Research and development engineer Ilara Calder. The article ended with a quote from the then COO, Leland Croft, expressing his deepest sympathies and assuring the public that the company's safety standards were second to none. Audra leaned back, the screen's glow illuminating her stunned face. Pen's wife hadn't just died. She had died here, in this company, in a fire that had been swept under the rug as a minor incident. And the man quoted, the man in charge of the response, was Leland. Suddenly, Pen's grief, his anger, his need to become invisible, it all snapped into sharp, horrifying focus. He wasn't just a grieving widower. He was a survivor of a corporate tragedy, and he had willingly returned to the scene of the crime to scrub its floors. Why? The question was a physical weight in Audra's chest. The next evening, before Pen's shift, she found herself driving through a part of the city she hadn't visited in years. She parked outside a small, well-kept park and watched from her car as Pen pushed Willa on a swing. The scene was so gentle, so normal. It felt like it belonged in a different universe. Willa's laughter pealed through the air, but then she dissolved into a fit of coughing, a dry, rattling sound that went on too long. Penn swept her off the swing immediately, his movements practiced and calm, murmuring soothing words as he helped her take a puff from an inhaler. Audra watched, her heart aching. She saw the fear behind his calm, the practiced way he monitored every breath his daughter took. The executive health plan wasn't just a bargaining chip anymore. It was a moral imperative. Later, back in the silent fortress of her office, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken knowledge. Audra watched Penn with new eyes as he prepared his tools. She saw the shadows of grief under his eyes, the immense weight he carried in the set of his shoulders. He was a man haunted by ghosts she was just beginning to see. He went to work on the third lock, the one with the time delay. It was a task of supreme patience. He couldn't force it. He could only wait, listen, and be ready when the mechanism was willing to yield. They sat in near silence for almost an hour, the only sound the faint hum of the city. "You must miss it," Audra said softly, breaking the quiet. "The work, the challenge of creating something." Penn didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the safe. "I miss the person I did it with," he said, his voice rough. "She believed you could build things that were honest. No tricks, no shortcuts, just good design. She said a well-built machine had integrity." The words were aimed at the safe, but they landed squarely on Audra, a quiet indictment of the company her father had built. Suddenly, a new sound. A soft, low thump from deep within the safe's mechanism. It was the sound of a weight dropping, of a lock releasing. Penn's entire body went taut. He leaned in, his fingers flying to the dial, turning it with a speed and precision that was breathtaking. There was a series of sharp, satisfying clicks, like a spine aligning. He leaned back, exhaling a breath he seemed to have been holding for 5 years. "The time lock is disengaged," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "There's just the final bolt mechanism left." He reached for a different tool, a specialized wrench. But as he leaned in, his hand froze. His eyes fixed on a spot near the main dial, a place half hidden by the ornate brasswork. Audra followed his gaze. It was a tiny, engraved mark, no bigger than a grain of rice. It wasn't a corporate logo. It was a stylized drawing of a starling, its wings spread. Penn's face went pale. He looked as if he'd seen a ghost for real this time. "Penn, what is it?" Audra asked, alarmed. He touched the engraving with a trembling finger, his voice a choked whisper. "The starling. It was her personal mark, her signature." He looked up at Audra, his eyes wide with a terrible, dawning realization. "This safe, this isn't just a production model. It's the prototype. It was the last project she was working on, the one they told me was destroyed in the fire." The words fell into the silence of the room and shattered it. Penn recoiled from the safe as if its steel had become white-hot. He stumbled back, his face a mask of disbelief and horror, shaking his head. "Number, it can't be." "Penn, what are you talking about?" Audra asked, rushing to his side. "The starling," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It was her signature, Ilara's. She put it on everything she was proud of." He looked at the safe, not with a craftsman's admiration, but with the agony of a man looking at a ghost. "They told me her final project was destroyed. They said there was nothing left." He turned on Audra, his quiet demeanor finally breaking, his eyes blazing with resurrected pain. "Did you know? Is this some kind of twisted game? Bringing me here to break into my own wife's work?" "No, Penn, I swear, I had no idea," Audra said, her voice pleading and sincere. She held up her hands, wanting to touch him, to steady him, but not daring to. "My father, he kept so many secrets. This safe, the lost key, it was just another one of his puzzles. I never knew it was connected to her. To you." Penn stared at her, searching her face for any hint of deception. He found none. He saw only a reflection of his own shock, his own dawning horror. He turned back to the safe, the anger draining out of him, leaving a hollow, aching void. He had been talking to it, listening to it, treating it like an adversary. But it wasn't. It was a part of her. The last part. "I can't do this," he said, his voice barely audible. "I can't." He was a breath away from walking out, from disappearing back into his quiet, gray life. "Pen, wait," Audra said gently. "Don't you see? Maybe this is why it wouldn't open for anyone else. It was waiting for you." She took a hesitant step closer. If this was her last project, maybe she left something inside, a message, something she wanted you to find. Her words struck a chord deep inside him. A message, an answer. For 5 years, the fire had been a black hole in his memory, a wall of senseless tragedy. But if this safe survived, then maybe something else did too. The motivation shifted inside him, the tectonic plates of his grief grinding into a new, sharp-edged purpose. This was no longer about a deal. It was about Ilara. He walked back to the safe, his movements slow, reverent. He looked at the final locking mechanism, a complex bolt system he now recognized with a pang of memory. He and Ilara had designed it together on a whiteboard in their kitchen, arguing over torque ratios and laughing over spilled coffee. He picked up the wrench. His hands didn't tremble. They moved with a sad, intimate familiarity, as if greeting an old friend. He wasn't just turning a wrench. He was retracing a conversation, completing a sentence they had started together long ago. With a final, resonant clack, the last bolt slid home. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then, with a low groan of metal, the immense steel door swung inward, revealing the darkness within. A darkness that had been sealed for 5 years. The air that drifted out smelled of old paper and something else. Faintly, impossibly, it smelled of her, of the lavender soap she always used. Resting on top of a stack of thick file folders was a small, cream-colored envelope. Pen's name was written on the front in Ilara's familiar, elegant script. His breath hitched. He reached in with a trembling hand and took it. His fingers fumbled with the seal. Inside was a single, folded sheet of paper. "My pen. Thinking of you while I wrestle with this beast. It's finally done. I think this might be my masterpiece. When this project is delivered, I'm taking you and Willa to that little cottage on the lake. A week with no machines, no deadlines, just us. I love you more than all the stars. Yours, Ilara." The note was dated the day of the fire. Pen sank to his knees, the paper crinkling in his fist, a single, choked sob escaping his lips. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a promise, a snapshot of a future that had been stolen from them, written just hours before she was gone. Audra watched, her heart breaking for him. She gave him a moment, then knelt beside him. "Pen," she said softly, "there's more." He looked up, his eyes hollow with grief. He nodded numbly. Audra reached into the safe and lifted out the thick folder that had been under the letter. The label on it read, "Project Starling. Final report and safety analysis." She opened it on the floor. The top pages were technical readouts, blueprints, material analyses, but beneath them was a thinner file. The first document was a purchase order for 1,000 feet of high-voltage wiring, sourced from a non-certified overseas supplier at a fraction of the standard cost. The signature authorizing the purchase was clear: Leland Croft. The next document was a formal memo, written and signed by Ilara Calder. It was a safety warning, flagging the new wiring as substandard and a critical fire hazard. She called the R&D lab a ticking time bomb and formally requested an immediate halt to all work until the wiring could be replaced. The memo was addressed to Leland Croft. It was dated the day before the fire. Audra stared at the page, at the damning, undeniable proof in her hands. She looked at Pen, who was still clutching the letter, a relic from a life that had been violently extinguished. Ilara's death wasn't an accident. It wasn't a tragedy. It was a consequence. A predictable, preventable outcome that Leland had been warned about and had ignored. The ghost in the machine had just spoken, and she was screaming for justice. Audra laid the memo on the floor beside Penn. He didn't look at it at first. His entire being focused on the precious, crinkled letter in his hand. He read it again and again, as if trying to memorize the shape of his wife's love. Then, slowly, his gaze lifted to the document Audra was holding out. He took it. He read the clinical, damning words. Substandard wiring, critical fire hazard, ticking time bomb. He saw the name at the bottom, Leland Croft, and the date. The day before his world ended. The grief that had hollowed him out moments before began to curdle, hardening into something else. It was a cold, sharp, diamond-hard rage. The fire wasn't fate. It wasn't a random tragedy. It was a line item on a budget sheet. His wife, his brilliant, vibrant Ilara, had been sacrificed for the price of cheaper wire. He killed her, Penn said. The words were quiet, devoid of emotion, which made them all the more terrifying. He stood up, the letter from Ilara still clutched in his hand. His transformation was absolute. The ghost was gone, and in his place stood an executioner. He knew, and he let her walk into that lab. "We have to go to the police," Audra said, her voice shaking with a mixture of horror and fury. "The press. We release this. It's over for him." "No." Penn's voice was firm. He was thinking clearly now. The mind that could dismantle complex machines now focused on dismantling a man. Leland would bury this. He'd claim it's a fabrication, a forgery I created to blackmail the company. He'd tie us up in court until we bled dry. He's had 5 years to perfect his story. We have a 5-year-old memo. He looked at her, his eyes clear and cold. "This is a weapon, but you don't win a war by firing your only bullet into the air." He was right. They were in a boardroom, not a courtroom. The rules were different. "What do we do?" Audra asked, looking at him now not as a janitor, but as her only ally. "We need more," Penn said, his strategic mind clicking into place. "This memo is the spark, but we need the fuel to burn him down. This purchase order." He tapped the paper. It was for 1,000 feet of wire. There are financial records, shipping manifests. He must have cut corners elsewhere, too. A man this reckless doesn't just do it once. It's a pattern. He paused, his mind digging through the past. And Ilara, she was meticulous. She never trusted digital-only backups. She always kept hard copies of her safety analyses off-site. Suddenly, they weren't a CEO and a janitor. They were partners in a covert operation, united by a shared enemy. Their mission had a name: Justice for Ilara. As if on cue, Penn's phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, his expression softening as he saw the caller ID. It was the specialist's office. He stepped away to answer it, his voice low. Audra watched him, saw his shoulders slump, his hand run through his hair in a gesture of pure stress. He hung up and turned back to her, the fire in his eyes banked by a familiar fear. "Willa," he said, "the specialist in Baltimore can see her, but the waiting list is 3 months long, unless we can get a premium consultation, which is just a sanitized way of saying you pay $10,000 to cut the line." The cold reality of his situation crashed back into the room. He was a man planning to take on a titan, but he couldn't afford to get his sick daughter the care she needed. Without a moment's hesitation, Audra took out her phone. She didn't dial the clinic. She dialed her personal physician, a man who sat on the board of 3 major hospitals. "David, it's Audra Langdon," she said, her voice shifting back into the effortless command of a CEO. "I need a favor. I'm sending you the file of a 7-year-old girl named Willa Calder. She needs to be seen by Dr. Eris at Johns Hopkins, this week." There was a pause. Audra listened, her expression unyielding. "I don't care what you have to move. My company is about to make a 7-figure donation to the pediatric wing. Make it happen." She hung up and looked at Penn. She has an appointment for Thursday morning. My jet will be waiting. Penn stared at her, speechless. It wasn't just the money. It was the speed, the decisiveness, the way she had sliced through a mountain of bureaucracy with a single phone call. It was the act of a partner. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling hopelessly inadequate. "Don't thank me," she said, her voice soft. "We're in this together now. Let's make him pay for what he did." She looked down at the documents spread across the floor, at the evidence of a crime that had been buried for 5 years. My father should have stopped him. He built this company. He should have protected the people in it. He didn't. She looked at Penn, her own eyes filled with a new, sharp-edged resolve. "I will." A new strength flowed between them, forged in grief and galvanized by purpose. Penn nodded, his mind already mapping out their next move. He knew Leland's patterns. He knew the company's blind spots. And more importantly, he knew Ilara's. He knew how she thought, how she worked, how she hid things. Her off-site backups, he said, a new idea taking root. It wasn't a server, it was analog, old-fashioned. She rented a small storage unit under a different name. She called it her library. He looked at Audra, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time. "Leland thinks he erased every trace of his crime, but my wife was an engineer. And engineers always build in a fail-safe." The hunt began not with a bang, but with a quiet, desperate search through the last vestiges of a life. Audra accompanied Penn back to his apartment. Stepping inside felt like crossing a sacred threshold. The air was different here, away from the cold, calculated world of her office. It was a space defined by a child's crayon drawings and the lingering presence of a woman she'd never met. Penn pulled a worn cardboard box from the top of a closet. The label on it just said, "Ilara's Things." His hands hesitated before opening it. Inside were books, a few pieces of jewelry, a collection of smooth stones from a beach they had loved. It was a time capsule of a shared life. She was clever, Penn murmured, sifting through the contents. The name would be a code, something meaningful to her. Audra watched as he picked up a heavy book, its cover worn from use. Pioneers of the Unseen, Great Women of Science. He opened it, and a faded receipt fluttered out from between the pages. A rental agreement for a self-storage unit from a facility across town. Penn's breath caught. The unit was rented under the name Rosalind Franklin, a brilliant scientist whose crucial work was stolen by her male colleagues. A woman who had been silenced. A perfect, heartbreaking piece of symbolism. "I've got it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. 20 minutes later, they were standing in front of a roll-up metal door in a long, sterile hallway that smelled of dust and concrete. Penn inserted the key, and the lock turned with a smooth click. He heaved the door upward, revealing the darkness within. He flicked a switch, and a single, bare bulb illuminated the space. It wasn't the dusty, forgotten crypt Audra had expected. It was an office. Meticulously organized, shockingly complete. 2 tall filing cabinets stood against one wall. Boxes of journals were stacked neatly, each labeled in Ilara's precise script. Rolled-up blueprints stood in tall canisters like ancient scrolls. It was a library of a single, brilliant mind. Ilara's failsafe. "She never threw anything away," Penn whispered, a sad smile touching his lips. He ran a hand along the top of a filing cabinet, a gesture of profound love and loss. They didn't have much time. They began to search, working as a seamless team. Penn knew her filing system, her logic. Audra, with her ability to absorb and process information at lightning speed, scanned documents, identifying key names and dates. They found it in the second drawer. A file labeled simply LC/safety. It contained the original, signed hard copy of the memo she had sent to Leland. But there was more. So much more. Beneath the memo were her handwritten notes from meetings with him. They detailed his dismissiveness, his open mockery of her concerns. One entry was chilling. Leland told me today that if I pushed the safety issue further, he would personally see to it that Project Starling's funding was cut. He said, "Don't be a hero, Alara. Heroes end up as martyrs." It was a direct threat, but the final discovery was the one that sealed Leland's fate. Tucked into a pocket at the back of the file was a separate, thinner folder. It contained safety reports Alara had compiled on 3 other construction and engineering projects Leland had overseen in the previous year. Each one detailed a similar pattern: cutting corners, using substandard materials, and ignoring safety protocols to meet budget targets and accelerate timelines. She had been building a case against him. "My God," Audra breathed, holding the folder. "It wasn't just your wife's lab, Penn. He's a serial risk-taker. He's been endangering employees for years. This could have happened to anyone." The crime was no longer a single, tragic event. It was a portrait of a predator, a man who treated human lives as acceptable losses in the pursuit of profit. They had it, the fuel to burn him down. The case was ironclad. They packed the most critical files into a banker's box, their hands moving with a shared, urgent purpose. As they closed the storage unit, the bare bulb plunging Alara's library back into darkness, Audra's phone buzzed with a high-priority notification. She glanced at it, and her face went pale. It was a text from Ian. "Urgent. Leland just invoked a bylaws clause. He's called an emergency board meeting for 9 a.m. tomorrow. He's forcing the vote on the Omnicorp acquisition. He says he has the proxies to win." Penn looked at her, then at the box of evidence in his hands. Their careful, strategic timeline had just evaporated. The war wasn't coming. It was here. They had less than 12 hours to deploy an arsenal of evidence against a man who had just seized control of the battlefield. "He knows," Audra said, her voice a strained whisper. "Somehow, he knows we're coming for him. And he's making his move now." The drive back to the Langdon Industries tower was a blur of high-stakes silence. The city's glittering lights seemed to mock them, indifferent to the bombshell they carried in a simple cardboard box. There was no time to go home, no time to think. There was only time to act. They turned Audra's office into a war room. She swept her desk clear with one arm, sending meaningless paperwork fluttering to the floor. Together, they laid out the contents of Alara's library across the vast mahogany surface. Memos, journals, blueprints, reports. It was a mosaic of a crime. For hours, they worked under the lonely glow of her desk lamp, fueled by coffee and a burning, righteous fury. Penn, the engineer, moved with a cold precision, cross-referencing blueprints with material invoices, creating a flawless technical timeline of Leland's negligence. He pointed out sheared bolt specifications, faulty wiring schematics, and structural weaknesses, his voice low and steady. Each observation another nail in Leland's coffin. Audra, the CEO, worked in parallel, building the narrative for the board. She translated Penn's technical data into the language the board understood: risk, liability, and catastrophic financial exposure. She drafted projections on potential lawsuits, regulatory fines, and the stock price collapse that would follow if this scandal ever became public. They were a perfect synthesis of heart and mind, of technical genius and corporate strategy. Around 3 a.m., Audra faltered. She stared at a photo stapled to a file, a picture of her father shaking hands with a much younger Leland. "My father trusted him," she whispered, her voice strained. "He let this man into the heart of his company. All this happened under his watch. When I exposed Leland, I exposed my father's failure." Penn stopped his work and looked at her. He picked up one of Alara's journals and pointed to a passage. "She wrote here that your father was the one who funded her research into safer materials, even when Leland called it a waste of money. Your father wasn't perfect, Audra, but he wasn't Leland. You're not tarnishing his legacy. You're fulfilling it." His words steadied her, a lifeline in her sea of doubt. Just before dawn, Penn's phone buzzed. It was Willa's morning alarm, his remote signal to call and wake her for school. He stepped onto the balcony, the cold morning air biting at his face. He forced a warmth into his voice that he didn't feel. "Hey, Doodlebug, time to wake up. Are you still at work, Daddy?" her sleepy voice asked. "Yeah, just a long night. But I'll be there to pick you up from school, I promise." "Okay, I love you." "I love you more than all the stars, sweet pea," he said, the words catching in his throat. He hung up, the promise he'd just made to his daughter stealing his resolve for the battle ahead. At 8:55 a.m., they walked into the boardroom. The air was frigid, the tension palpable. The board members were already seated, a gallery of grim, stony faces aligned with Leland, who sat at the head of the table like a king on his throne. When they saw Penn walking in beside Audra, there was a ripple of confusion. He wasn't in his janitor's uniform. He wore a dark, well-fitted suit Audra had procured from the company's executive tailor. He was no longer invisible. He was a statement. Leland smirked. "Audra, cutting it a little close. And who is your guest?" "Mr. Calder is here at my invitation," Audra said smoothly, taking her seat. "I see," Leland said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Well, as this is an emergency meeting with a single agenda item, perhaps your friend can wait outside. I now call for the vote on the immediate acceptance of the Omnicorp acquisition offer. The vote can wait," Audra said, her voice cutting through the room like glass. Leland laughed. "I'm afraid it can't. I have the proxy votes. This is a formality." "Is it?" Audra stood, her gaze sweeping across the hostile faces at the table. "Before we vote on the future of this company, I believe it's imperative that the board be made fully aware of its past, specifically its ongoing and catastrophic legal liabilities." She gestured to Penn. "This is Penn Calder. And while some of you may have seen him maintaining our facilities, his true qualifications are far more relevant to our present situation. Until 5 years ago, he was one of the senior mechanical engineers in our R&D division." A wave of shock rippled through the room. Leland's smirk tightened. "At my request," Audra continued, "Mr. Calder has spent the last several days conducting a comprehensive risk assessment analysis of past projects supervised by our current chairman." Penn stepped forward to the head of the table. He was calm, focused, his voice steady. He did not speak as a grieving husband. He spoke as an engineer. For 15 minutes, he laid out the facts. He spoke of compromised materials, of falsified safety inspections, of ignored warnings. He presented a cool, clinical, and utterly damning case of systemic negligence, all traced back to decisions made by Leland Croft. He concluded with Project Starling. He placed Alara's final memo on the projector, her elegant handwriting filling the screen. Her words, ticking time bomb, hung in the air like a death sentence. He never once mentioned she was his wife. He didn't have to. The truth was devastating enough on its own. The board was silent, their faces pale with horror. Leland finally found his voice, sputtering with rage. "This is absurd. A fabrication by a disgruntled former employee, concocted with his new girlfriend. It's slander." "Is it?" Audra said calmly. She clicked a remote, and the screen changed, now displaying the signed purchase orders, the budget analyses showing the cost savings, all approved with Leland's signature. "The evidence is, as I believe you'll find, irrefutable," Audra said, her voice cold as steel. "For years, Mr. Croft has systematically gambled with the lives of our employees to inflate his profit margins. He is not an asset to this company. He is a liability of unimaginable proportions." She looked directly at Leland, whose face had collapsed into a mask of pure panic. "The question before this board is no longer about an acquisition. The question is what we are going to do about a man who sacrificed a brilliant engineer to save a few $1,000s on wiring." The room was utterly still. The power had shifted. Leland Croft, the king, was naked, his empire of lies crumbling around him. The battle was over. The silence that followed was the sound of a world shifting on its axis. The board members stared, not at Audra, but at Leland, seeing him for the first time not as a leader, but as a walking, breathing lawsuit. The smug confidence had vanished from his face, replaced by the pale, clammy look of a man watching his life unravel in real time. He was escorted from the room by security, sputtering denials and threats that held no power. The vote that followed was swift and unanimous. Leland Croft was removed from the board and his position as chairman, effective immediately. A full, independent investigation was launched. Audra was granted unconditional authority to manage the crisis and the company. The war was over. Back in her office, the adrenaline faded, leaving a profound quiet in its wake. Penn stood by the window, looking out over the city. He was holding the box of Ilara's work, not like evidence anymore, but like a treasure. "She would have been proud of you today," Audra said softly from behind him. He turned, a faint, weary smile on his face. "She would have been proud of us." In that moment, the last wall between them crumbled. They weren't a CEO and an engineer, or a boss and an employee. They were two people who had walked through fire together and come out the other side. A few days later, the three of them, Audra, Penn, and a bubbling, excited Willa, were soaring at 30,000 feet. Audra's private jet was a world away from the sterile clinics Willa was used to. She bounced on the plush leather seats, her face pressed against the window. "Are we really above the clouds?" she chirped. "We really are," Audra said, smiling as she handed Willa a juice box. Penn watched them, a feeling of surreal peace settling over him. For 5 years, his world had been small and gray, a life of just getting by. Now his daughter was laughing in a private jet on her way to see the best doctor in the country, sitting next to a woman who had seen the ghost inside him and wasn't afraid. The news from the hospital in Baltimore was everything they had dared to hope for. Dr. Aris, a woman with kind eyes and a brilliant mind, confirmed that the new treatment was a perfect match for Willa's condition. With the comprehensive insurance Audra had provided, the entire year-long course of therapy was approved and scheduled. Willa's future, once a question mark, was now a statement. 6 months later, Langdon Industries was a different company. The name was the same, but the soul had been replaced. Under Audra's leadership, it was gaining a new reputation, one built on transparency and quality. Penn, as the new head of research and innovation, had transformed the R&D labs. Safety wasn't just a protocol. It was the first principle of design. Together, they launched the Ilara Calder Foundation, a multi-million-dollar initiative funded by the company to provide scholarships and mentorship for young women entering the fields of science and engineering. Ilara's name was no longer a sad footnote in a corporate tragedy. It was an inspiration. One sunny afternoon, Penn and Audra walked through the same park where she had once watched him from her car. Willa, her face glowing with health, ran ahead, chasing a butterfly, her laughter echoing through the trees. There was no cough, no inhaler, just the pure, unadulterated joy of a child who felt good. Penn stopped walking and turned to Audra. "You know," he said, a playful glint in his eye, "a while back, you made me a rather rash proposal regarding a certain safe." Audra's lips curved into a slow smile. "I believe I did. It involved a wedding, if I recall." "That's the one," he said, his voice growing serious. He took her hand, his thumb tracing circles over her knuckles. "I've been thinking about it, and I think I'm finally ready to open that lock." Audra's smile widened, her eyes shining. "Is that so, Mr. Calder?" "It is," he said, his voice soft. "On one condition." "What's that?" "That this time," he said, leaning in to kiss her, "we open it together." They built a life that was quiet, strong, and true. It was a life filled with Sunday morning pancakes, with homework and board meetings, with the comfortable silence of two people who understood each other's souls. They didn't chase ghosts anymore. They built a future worthy of the memories they honored. Some things, they learned, weren't meant to be disposable. The most valuable things, love, integrity, second chances, were built to last forever. Now, I want to hear from you. No matter where you are in the world, your story matters. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from, because your presence here makes our community stronger. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you that even the most difficult locks can be opened with patience and love, please consider subscribing to the channel. We have so many more stories to share. Stories of hope, healing, and the incredible strength of the human heart. Thank you for spending your time with us. Until our next story, be kind to one another, be brave in the face of your own challenges, and always remember, true strength isn't about the walls we build to protect ourselves, but about having the courage to unlock what's hidden inside.